The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, on the Facebook page Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The website is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series, General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, a place, or an event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, the Lieber Code, Part 1. I'm General Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me today in the library as we reflect a bit about the Lieber Code, or it became known as the Lieber Code. Officially, it was General Orders Number 100, and for the conduct of the war. And in order to look at the presentation of the 157 articles of the Lieber Code, it's important to know who and what, why, how about the man who essentially wrote the Lieber Code. He had 4 other generals to assist him, but they were not involved. Francis Lieber essentially wrote the code, and what he wrote was approved and sent to President Lincoln. Now, let's get to know Francis or Franz Lieber a bit. He was born in Berlin, the capital city of, at that time, Prussia, in either 1798 or 1800. There's some argument over which year it was, because he lied about his age to join the Prussian army to fight Napoleon, but more about that in a moment. He said, as an adult, war must be waged with justice, not less than by force. Those are powerful words. War must be waged with justice, not less than by force. And that's a man who fought in 2 wars. However, to go on, he was the 10th of 12 children to an upper middle, lower upper class German iron maker in Berlin in 1800, essentially. We'll go with that year. And in 1806, he saw Napoleon's troops march into Berlin. The next several years, as he grew up, they were under French oppression. And when he was 15, he lied about his age to join the army, and he fought Napoleon. In fact, he was wounded in the Waterloo campaign, and in the throat and chest, left for dead. But he was found on the field. He recovered, and he comes back home, and he went to school. Well, he was jailed by the Prussian authorities because he was felt to be subversive, and actually he was a liberal activist, and he had begun writing his publications. And he couldn't go to school there in Berlin, so he went off to Jena, and by the time, within just a couple of years, he had a doctorate in mathematics. The man was brilliant. So he gets a doctorate in mathematics. Then he decides, pressure from the Prussian police, and he ran off and joined to fight in the Greek War, which was a big disappointment. He did some fighting, but essentially he and his fellow Germans that went to fight were robbed. They weren't allowed to do much fighting. They were very ill-treated. And in the Greek War against the Turks in 1821. So then he decides to leave that, and he found his way to Rome. And in Rome, to make some money, he began teaching and tutoring students, and a Prussian nobleman arranged it that he could return back to Berlin. He couldn't go to school there. Then that's when he went and got his doctorate. But he got locked up again, and decided he would, by this time, he would go to London. And in, I believe, 1825, he went to London, and he was there for about a year. He met his wife, Matilda, whom he later married. And he met an American, wealthy American, whom I'll name later, and decides to go to America because at this time he's become an outstanding gymnast and is very much into the health and physical fitness movement, and decides to go to America, which he did, and worked in Boston for about a year. And while he was there, again trying to make money, his interests switched from mathematics and gymnastics, physical fitness, to politics, law, and history. And he was trying to get a job teaching in the Northeast. He loved the cultural center, the intellectual centers, and he's also busily writing. But he got involved in the writing of the Encyclopedia Americana, and because he was impressed with the German encyclopedia. But I have digressed a bit. Let me go back and cover this with you. A letter from Francis, not Franz, he Americanized his name, to Major General Halleck in November of 1862 said in part, "Ever since the beginning of our present war, it has appeared clearer and clearer to me that the President ought to issue a set of rules and definitions providing for the most urgent cases occurring under the laws and usages of war, and in which our articles of war are silent." As a result of that, on April 24th of 1863, President Lincoln issued Special Orders Number 100, titled Instructions for the Government of the Armies of the United States in the Field, commonly known as the Lieber Code. Now, prior to that, military treatment of prisoners and the conduct of warfare had been based on custom and tradition. Well, the American Civil War was unique in many ways, but it upended custom and tradition. We have an influx of thousands upon thousands of soldiers to fight, and hundreds upon hundreds of officers who have no military background, and essentially, perhaps blunt to say, didn't know what they were doing, particularly when it came to the treatment of prisoners, and more particularly when it came to the treatment of blacks, runaway blacks, the fugitive blacks, blacks that were freed as we moved through Southern Territory. Well, prior to that, there was no set way to handle these issues, and these issues very quickly became very difficult issues. Attempts to codify military law go back as far as 1385 at Durham, and then 1643 with the Articles and Ordinances of War for the present expedition of the Army of the Kingdom of Scotland. So there have been many efforts to codify and organize how war is conducted and the treatment of civilian populations, property, and so forth. But the Lieber Code was the first comprehensive codification of laws and customs of war, and it was developed by Franz Lieber, who, as I indicated earlier, came to the United States when he was 28. By this time, he's an international lawyer, and I've told you about him joining the army and fighting against Napoleon, being left for dead, gets a doctorate in mathematics, fights in the Greek War of Independence, 1821, 1822 to 23, he's in Rome teaching. He goes back to Berlin, and after those two prison sojourns, they couldn't get anything on him. He's finally released, and the second time he decided to leave, and he went to England, goes to London for a year, where he had been imprisoned in Prussia as an enemy of the state. He didn't care for that. Now, I mentioned earlier an American he met in London. It was John Neal, and he was studying gymnastics and intent on bringing that movement of physical fitness to the United States. And he was employed by John Neal. He came to America and began a gymnasium and swimming program in Boston. Well, that went away pretty quickly because Americans tired of the novelty of the new physical fitness program and the swimming. Now, while he was in Boston, he edited the Encyclopedia Americana, and he got that idea after translating into English from German the Brockhaus Encyclopedia. And the Encyclopedia Americana was published in Philadelphia in 13 volumes between the years of 1829 and 1833. And in 1833, he became an American citizen. By now, he's married his wife Matilda that he brought over from London, and he started to having a family. And in the process, he became a confidant of Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, because he was doing research for him and helping edit it, some works he was doing on penology, statistics that de Tocqueville was looking at. He became friends with Daniel Webster, Charles Sumner. He became a walking who's who of New England intellects, but he's still trying to find a job teaching in New England, and he couldn't get one. So he took a job in 1835 at the South Carolina College in Charleston, South Carolina, now the University of South Carolina. And he took a job teaching as a professor of history and political economics. They combined those two areas. And he stayed there until, this is from 1835 to 1856. Now, while he was there, he wrote 3 major works. One of those was on civil liberty and self-government in 1853. And it became an immediate bestseller, sold 100,000 copies, which is incredible in 1853. And it eventually was adopted as a standard college text. As I said, the man was brilliant. But he was also anti-slavery, anti-secession, and oddly enough, pro-states' rights. But he was well known and respected in his community, but he was always an outsider. He and his wife were bringing in his cousins and family members to work in their home as their maids and housekeepers, but he was pressured to buy 2 slaves because the neighborhood felt it was not right for white women to do that work. So he was forced really to stay in sync with his culture to have 2 slaves, although he himself was solidly anti-slavery. But this went along for a while until 1854, and he actively campaigned to be named the new president of South Carolina College, and he was not, because it was said he was soft on slavery. So by this time, in 1854, he quits working at teaching at the South Carolina College and goes back to New York City. And there's a parallel there, it would seem, because 1854 was a difficult year for both of us, because I resigned from the Army and came back to St. Louis. But 1854 was a difficult year for both of us. He went back to New York. He did some writing, more pamphlet writing and teaching. But in 1856, he was employed to teach at Columbia College, which later became Columbia University. And he was able to choose the title himself because they hired him, they really wanted him. And he decided to be a professor of political science and economics. And he developed the title. He also developed the title publicist. He was his own publicist. And he therefore became officially the first political scientist in the United States. By 1860, he's also professor of political science in the Columbia Law School, and that's a post he held to his death until his death in 1872. And while he was at Columbia, he lectured on constitutional questions relating to the principles and rules applicable in time of war. So Francis Lieber has, all his adult life, had a deep and abiding interest in how prisoners are treated. Now, he sided with the United States in the war, even though he'd been a prominent citizen of resident of South Carolina, and had indeed been a slave owner himself, even though over his protests within his own home. And his brothers-in-law were members of the powerful Oppenheimer family dynasty and owned plantations and slaves in Puerto Rico. Now, he had 3 sons. 2 of them fought for the North and 1 of them fought for the South. His oldest son, Oscar, was a geologist in South Carolina, and when Lieber moved back to New York, to New England, to New York City, Oscar stayed behind, and when the war started, he fought with the Confederacy. He was killed fairly early in the war at the Battle of Williamsburg. So he was killed as a member of the Confederate Army. The second son was named Hamilton, and Hamilton entered the Union Army in an Illinois regiment as first lieutenant, and he lost his left arm at Fort Donelson fighting under me. So there's another parallel. His third son, Norman, fought throughout the war and miraculously was unhurt. But he later, after the war, became the adjutant general of the United States Army. So Franz Lieber had 1 son killed as a Confederate soldier, 2 sons fighting as Federal soldiers. One loses his left arm, and the other one ultimately becomes adjutant general of the United States Army. Quite the man and quite the family. But when the war broke out, Lincoln wanted federal officers to have instructions on the questions and legal issues, particularly resulting from non-international conflicts, even though the Confederacy was trying to make this an international conflict by claiming to be a separate nation. And the issues were how to treat captured Confederate States of America soldiers as traitors subject to the death penalty or prisoners of war, and how could they be treated as legitimate combatants without officially recognizing the Confederate States of America as a sovereign country. So this is something that's a real struggle. And Lieber argued that this was for considerations of law, authority, humanity, and wise foresight, because he also pointed out that federal prisoners would be treated in the same manner as we treated Confederate prisoners. So that reciprocity loomed large in the mind of Lieber and also with President Lincoln. Now, as for avoiding the recognition of the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, Lieber said that wouldn't be formal diplomatic recognition, but the recognition of reality, phrase he used. And this is an example. When a highway robber asked my purse, and I, being unarmed, considered it expedient to give it, I certainly recognized the robber. It is no more than a recognition of fact. So, but go on to the other possibly thornier question, how to treat freed or runaway slaves. Now, laws in force at the time were not in favor of freeing slaves. Remember, the Fugitive Slave Act is still a federal law because that would be against the rules, the customs, and tradition of civilized warfare, because it would be tantamount to confiscating civilian property. If you take in a runaway slave or you free a slave as you move through the territory and you put them to work or you just free them, in essence, you're confiscating that civilian's property. And it was indeed a thorny question. And to arm those freed or fugitive slaves was even more thorny of a question. Now, Lieber was firm in his argument that fugitive slaves of seceded states were automatically free if they came within federal lines and therefore within federal jurisdiction. If they were captured as fighters, they were entitled to be treated with the same humanitarian treatment as any other prisoner of war. But with no guidance or guidelines before the Lieber Code, every officer had a different opinion and took a different action. In a pamphlet Lieber wrote in 1862, he set out rules for treatment of captured guerrillas or other irregulars. He felt that when captured in a fair fight, they should be treated as any soldier until or unless other circumstances, such as murder, sacking places, killing of prisoners, etc., is proved or are proved. This was addressed in his pamphlet titled Guerrilla Parties Considered with References to the Laws and Usages of War in 1862. In November of 1862, the President then appointed a committee of 4 Union commanders and Francis Lieber, all recommended by Major General Henry Halleck. And they were told to develop a manual, a legal manual for soldiers that would address those questions and a number of others. Now, the people with Lieber were General Hitchcock, General Hartsuff as a field commander, General Martindale, who was a lawyer and a military governor of the District of Columbia, but he soon retired, and General Cadwalader. Now, those 4 fellows were primarily interested in the conduct of the war, not so much in the treatment of prisoners. They had little to do with Lieber's writing of the code, and Lieber is almost exclusively responsible for the writing of the Lieber Code. Nathaniel Banks, in November of '62, wrote this message to Lieber. Many points are greatly abused, and in some respects our people entertain erroneous views. No distinction is made in the public mind between the plunder of people by individual soldiers for their own gain and the confiscation of property by commanding officers for the support of armies. To a civilian, it all looked the same. Your barn being emptied is your barn being emptied, regardless of the purpose for the carrying off of your goods. By the time Lieberman finished his code, his oldest son had been killed in action at the Battle of Williamsburg, so he had a deep interest and understanding of what's involved in the conduct of war and how people should be treated. Lincoln endorsed what he'd written on April the 24th of 1863 and had it distributed to all federal commanders in the field. So that's how the Lieber Code generally came to be, and that's a lot of information on Francis Lieber, Franz Lieber, the man who was responsible for the Lieber Code. Brilliant man, fought in 2 wars, as I've indicated before. He has a doctorate in mathematics, authority in gymnastics, an authority in education, public education. He got into that as well. He became authority on law, international law, taught international law, taught common law and contracts at Columbia Law School, wrote 3 massive treatises. One became a standard college textbook. Brilliant man, deeply intellectual man. But that's Francis Lieber, and some background on him, and some background on how the Lieber Code came to be written. In part 2, we'll look at specific parts of the 157 different articles in the Lieber Code. So, for now, I'm General Ulysses S. Grant from my study, bidding you a fond adieu.